All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on the River Rising Solutions webcast. I'm Shannon Blankenship, the Advocacy Director at St. John's Riverkeeper, and I am joined by my co-host, Jimmy Orth, Executive Director. Tonight on episode 3 of the River Rising Solutions webcast, we're going to discuss how public spaces, especially our parks, are a part of the resiliency solution. We're going to be joined by Carl Strauss, Director of Conservation at the National Recreation and Parks Association, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the advancement of public parks, recreation, and conservation. Tonight on this episode, we're going to cover the status of public parks for resiliency in Northeast Florida. We're going to have our guest speaker join us to discuss if our parks can save us from rising waters. And then we're going to end with viewer comments and questions, so stick around for that. To begin, Jimmy, would you mind telling people about St. John's Riverkeeper and how this web series is helping us to fulfill our mission to defend the St. John's River and advocate for its protection?
Absolutely, and I'll keep it brief because I know some of you may have tuned into previous episodes or be familiar with us, but St. John's Riverkeeper is a nonprofit advocacy group for the river. We're essentially a watchdog group for the St. John. And so a lot of the work we do is advocating for policies that are going to protect the river, ensuring that our laws are being implemented and they're being enforced, and that our laws are adequate, frankly, to protect the St. John. So a lot of our work is around, I guess you could say, holding our elected officials accountable to make sure they're implementing the type of protections that are necessary, but also holding polluters accountable. Another thing that we do that's really important is obviously raising awareness and getting people familiar with the issues and getting them engaged also. Advocacy is only as effective as a number of constituents for the river that we have and the number of people that we can get engaged to take action. And so we try to empower the public to take action and get involved. And we do a lot through education. We have actually a full-time education director and part-time education specialist who go into the schools. Obviously, they're not doing that right now, unfortunately. So we've been developing a lot of really great virtual resources and videos that teachers and parents can take advantage of. So a lot of our work revolves around that advocacy, getting people engaged and involved in the process, and then also, of course, educating people so they're more familiar with the river. And then we also like to try to get people out on the water. So that's always an important part of what we do too, is trying to provide those type of opportunities. This series is really important. You know, as we're seeing sea level rise, and then of course as we dredge and make changes to the river, we're only exacerbating the problems that we're seeing with sea level rise and the impacts of climate change. And so it's important that not only we're aware of what those impacts are, but what's really important about what the solutions are and how we're going to resolve these problems. And so this whole series is really designed, this phase of it, I should say. We've done a lot with our River Rising campaign to raise awareness around the problems with flooding and sea level rise. But this is really about identifying those solutions, because we have to start working towards that end. And right now, you know, Jacksonville in particular, and a lot of places within our watershed, frankly, are really behind the curve. And we have a lot of work to do to catch up and to work towards creating more resilient communities.
Jimmy, I want to ask you before we jump into talking about parks today. As a lifelong resident of Jacksonville and Northeast Florida, I know that you are familiar with the fact that we have one of the largest urban park systems in the nation. We have over 400 parks, more than 80,000 acres. So I wanted to ask you, what stands out when you think about resiliency in Jacksonville parks?
Well, you know, I think, well, I'm going to do something real quick. I'm going to actually expand that, because the parks that we have actually throughout the whole watershed of the St. John's, really extremely blessed to have incredible park system. And that includes this from the state, the federal government, and obviously local governments. And so we have to look at that, you know, up and down the river and the opportunities. I think for Jacksonville in particular, because it is the largest, I really see opportunity. I mean, we're not doing, as far as I know right now in Jacksonville, a lot to incorporate resiliency strategies into those park systems so that they're serving multiple purposes for our communities. But we have such an opportunity, and we have so much riverfront property. And so I think too, if you look at areas like the Timaquan Preserve up in the northern part, we have a lot of actually natural infrastructure, a lot of natural shorelines, oyster beds, and things like that that can really serve as natural barriers and buffers for storm surge and to help us be more resilient in the future. So we have a lot of this natural green infrastructure, but we also have a lot of parks where we could implement a lot of green infrastructure all up and all throughout our community. So I think it's the opportunity that excites me, even though we're not really, that I'm aware of doing that much, but I think we have so much opportunity to take advantage of these parks to integrate resiliency strategies to create a more resilient community. And so we're actually fortunate in that regard.
Well, I agree with you. We've got the land, we've got the space, we've set aside the property, and so thinking about multiple benefits is really where a lot of other cities are heading. You know, that we're seeing here, and where we know that we could, you know, be heading ourselves, not just in Jacksonville, but holistically throughout the St. Johns River watershed.
Right. And I know Carl's going to talk more specifically about this, but like you said, when you see these pictures and you see these photos and these renderings of what other communities are currently doing or are planning to do, and how they're using parks really as a strategy, not only to provide the recreation that the community so needs, some recreational opportunities, but also the opportunities for these to provide stormwater mitigation and all the other benefits that come with parks. I think that's the thing that excites me too, is the return on investment when you really integrate multiple benefits that these parks provide. It really is amazing, the return on investment that they provide to our communities.
I want to bring in our guest into the discussion now, because he works at the national level to see where local parks are making a real difference. Carl Strauss, Director of Conservation at the National Recreation and Parks Association, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to let you just start off by telling us a little bit about what the National Recreation Parks Association does, and then find out how you guys are seeing parks serving as critical infrastructure for resiliency in our cities.
Sure. So the National Recreation Park Association is the leading voice for the park and rec profession. Like you mentioned, we're a national nonprofit, and we represent approximately 65,000 park and rec professionals from 10,000 communities across the country. And we focus primarily on local park and rec. And what we do is we try and help our park and rec member agencies and professionals get access to the best resources, training, education, and provide funding so that they can do the type of innovative work that supports the communities, like you saw in some of the photos previously. We focus on 3 pillars, as we call them. One of them is conservation, which I oversee, and that covers everything from climate resiliency, which we'll be talking a lot about tonight, but goes all the way through environmental education, natural resource management, and even into operations and facilities sustainability. And we also have a really robust focus on health. So supporting all of the community health outcomes that parks provide. So obviously the ones that come first to mind, such as exercise, but also some things that might not come first to mind, such as providing food access or elder care. And then the final one is we focus on equitable access, because we know that parks are fantastic, but they are firstly not distributed equally, and we know that that unequal distribution often aligns with other forms of community disinvestment, and even ties back to historical racial inequities, which continue to reverberate, such as redlining. So we really focus first and foremost on making sure that there is a park within a 10-minute walk of everyone in the country, and that those parks are high quality and well maintained.
Excellent. I know that you're going to talk a lot about resiliency in today's discussion. What is a park to you? that you in particular you want to highlight that it's allowed you to kind of have this conservation and resiliency focus?
So I'm going to talk about a park that NRPA funded in Atlanta. But before I do that, I realized that I forgot the second part of your intro question about parks serving as critical infrastructure. And you know, every conversation these days starts with COVID, and we've obviously been running on all cylinders to help our Park and Rec members understand how to adapt to the new reality that we're all living in. So relatively early on in the pandemic, in April, we actually did a brief Park Pulse survey, which is where we survey the general public on their perceptions of Park and Rec. And what we found in that survey was that 83% of adults in America feel that parks are essential to their physical and mental health during the time of COVID. And again, that was in April, and I think that I'm sure all of you on the phone, if you're lucky enough to live near a park, can you know, that resonates with you. I am lucky enough to live within a park, and I'm there probably 3 times a day, and I think my mental health would certainly suffer if I didn't have access to that green space during this time. But beyond that, they're also a place where we can, in good times and in bad, socially connect with our neighbors at a safe distance, or hopefully in the future at a normal distance. And they are really the hearts of what makes a community great. And I think that as we've all been, you know, spending more time at home and in the communities that our homes are situated in, I think we've really come to recognize as a nation really how important it is to have the public open green space and a great park nearby. And that is exactly what we found in that survey. And it, you know, in addition, hopefully COVID goes away. So parks provide a suite of benefits to our communities all the time. You know, they provide social benefits. So a lot of the things that I mentioned that our health department works on, and the connection aspects that they provide, especially when there's a rec center or a playground or a ball court there. They provide a suite of environmental benefits. So they improve community resiliency, which we'll talk about more, but they're also really critical pieces for wildlife habitat. They provide clean air and clean water. And they also are huge economic engines for our community, which I think is often not recognized. So even just directly through the park departments themselves, they spend $166 billion each year in operations and capital expenditures. And that doesn't include at all any of the economic benefits that are provided to communities through the health benefits, through the resiliency benefits, through the tourism benefits. And I wanted to point out that Florida should be proud because in our study, which was done in 2016 of the economic benefits, you came in at number 2 with just over $10 million that your park departments reinvest back into your local economies. So I wanted to make sure I got that out. But now to turn back to one of those really signature park projects that NRPA is proud to have been a supporter of. That's the Katherine Johnston Memorial Park, which is in Atlanta, on Atlanta's west side. And this was funded through NRPA's Great Urban Parks campaign. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Atlanta, the west side of Atlanta has really been historically disinvested. And the community in which Katherine Johnston Memorial Park is situated suffered from repetitive flooding events. And actually from repetitive sewer overflow events. So we're not just talking about rainwater that's getting into people's basements in that situation. We're talking about untreated sewage that was flooding the basements of the surrounding community. So obviously just a serious health issue and quality of life issue for a neighborhood that was also, you know, under-resourced in a number of areas. So we worked closely with Park Pride, who is a local nonprofit there, along with the Department of Parks and Recreation in Atlanta, and were the first investors in really transforming what was essentially a city-owned but vacant site into the park that you see in front of you. And it was quite the undertaking. And I should mention that this ended up being a multi-million-dollar project, and NRPA provided just a piece of the funding. But just to give you a sense of everything that needed to be done was even before anything got installed, they had to remove thousands of tons of contaminated soil from this site to even get to a blank slate from which they could start building from. And throughout the process, there was continuous community engagement, and this whole initiative actually started years before through community visioning events, which were led by the local nonprofit Park Pride, to really get the local community to think about, what do you want the park system that you have in your community to look like? And then they took that vision and they started to fundraise around that, and they started to actually implement that vision, which has just been a tremendous boon for that community to see, their plans and their dreams get really realized in front of them, and start to, reap all of those co-benefits that parks provide. And so in this case, the original plan actually called for an open, essentially, lake feature, floodable lake feature, that would serve to be that stormwater detention area, and then it would obviously dissipate as that peak subsided. But through the conversation with the community, we realized they really didn't want an open lake. They didn't really want a water feature at this park. None of them had boats. They had seen this site be vacant and unused, and they had some real questions about long-term maintenance related to an open water feature, which I think any of us can understand if you put yourself in the shoes of that community. And they really wanted access to green space, places to recreate, places to play sports, places to have a picnic. So we took that, and in our design, this looks like a very typical park, because that green area, that turf grass area on top, is actually covering a retention basin that captures 3.5 million gallons of stormwater. So it's a really amazing feat of engineering, and it provides really this kind of green cover, this community asset, to what is a engineered stormwater solution, but has all these other benefits that come along with situating this in a park and having this open for as public recreation space.
That's what I was interested in, by the way. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought it was so interesting that it looks so conventional, and that's the thing that struck me, is it provides all these benefits, but it looks so conventional. And I mean, I was reading about it, and there's rain gardens and constructed wetlands also, and it's just amazing that able to incorporate all that in such a conventional looking park.
Yeah, it's really quite a feat. And you really need to know to even recognize how powerful this park is, what's going on below your feet. And then, like you mentioned, that water can get piped and channeled into more typical natural green infrastructure, such as rain gardens and bioretention areas. But the bulk of that heavy lifting, as far as addressing the stormwater issue for this site and for the surrounding community, is done by that basin, which is just completely blind from above.
So the one thing that really stands out to me about this example is just, again, the multiple benefits. So we're not just talking about flooding and water quality, but really a neighborhood asset, creating a neighborhood asset, which was formerly, a toxic mess, and creating something that everyone's going to enjoy. But it sounds like it definitely involved bringing in a lot more stakeholders than just the Parks Department, or even just the Public Works Department, but really having everyone come together and create a vision for what was going to be the best use of this space.
Yeah, you're completely right. And like I said, we were the first funders to the table to support this work. But as you all know, great on the ground projects start years in advance of people like NRPA or others coming to the table to say, let's make this vision a reality. They require consistent and authentic community engagement. And, and just to create this required the support of dozens of foundations and other nonprofits, Park Pride, the Conservation Fund, and then a host of city agencies, particularly Parks and Rec, and also the Watershed Department, who is a huge player in green infrastructure in Atlanta.
I was pleased to see that Chattahoochee Riverkeeper was also a partner in terms of environmental education to the surrounding community, which I thought was really cool too. And I was also it was amazing to see that you could, this isn't really necessarily about the resiliency, at least in terms that we've been talking about in terms of environmental resiliency, but the way that they've actually incorporated job training into this. I saw that the community is actually coming in and being involved actually in learning trades in the building of that park, which I was fascinated by that concept of how you can integrate job creation and job training into a project like this.
Yeah, and I think, actually in Atlanta, the Green and Youth Foundation, who was one of the local partners on the workforce development side, they actually do job training around green infrastructure. There's enough green infrastructure in Atlanta and plan to go in Atlanta that they actually have that critical mass that's needed to support careers in that field. So they do workforce development training specifically around green infrastructure, construction, and maintenance, which is, like you said, it's just another fantastic co-benefit, especially when those jobs can go back to that local community. And I think, we'll talk a little bit about this later, but I think, as you mentioned already, one of the huge advantages of green infrastructure over traditional gray infrastructure is the co-benefits that are inherent in green features. And I think that those benefits are only maximized when that green infrastructure is located in a park and recreation setting. Because then you're really getting into the environmental education piece, you're getting into that recreation piece, and you're just building that public awareness by locating it in a site that people frequent in a way you're not when the green infrastructure is hidden away or tucked away on some other land.
And
That makes sense.
Shannon, will you briefly I know just for people on the call, the difference between gray and green, because I think that's something that sometimes people get stuck on, exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, and so this series is really all about the different solutions to rising waters and flooding, and so we'll get to cover extensively, more about green infrastructure and what that means. But just to think about it, our gray infrastructure is going to be that traditional concrete type of solutions like culverts, bulkheads, and storm drains, whereas green infrastructure is rethinking how we can use natural retention of water into different areas to have multiple benefits, whether it's things like tree trenches or natural plantings in our sidewalks and right of way, thinking about harvesting water instead of directly putting it out into our storm drains that enter into waterways like the St. John's or our tributaries. So gray versus green, just natural benefits as opposed to engineered solutions, or they're all engineered solutions, right? But mimicking nature versus trying to move water as fast as possible. And Carl, I want to go back to the park that you featured and really get to the heart of, I think, what is being discussed here in Jacksonville. I want to ask specifically about parks that are built to flood. And so I'm hoping you can tell us more about how a space can be flooded and can be designed to flood, but then also at times of non-high water, non-flood times, can serve as a public space for park programming.
Sure. And I think we're seeing this across the country in coastal cities. New York comes to mind, Houston comes to mind, but also inland cities, Davenport, Iowa comes to mind, who have really rethought how they are approaching their relationship to the river and to the riverfront area in a way that obviously provides protection for the upland or inland communities, but really transforms their riverfront into one of their most valuable, or if not the most valuable, public asset that they have. So, you know, pulling from any of those scenarios, I think the solutions end up looking pretty similar. And it's really about reconnecting rivers to their floodplains at kind of the broadest level, and doing that using green infrastructure and natural features. So the key to designing a floodable park is to essentially limit the amount of infrastructure that goes in the park that could be damaged by floodwaters. That sounds very obvious when I say it out loud, but that's, you know, making sure that the features that go in there are robust enough and designed in a way that they can withstand the projected floods that will occur. Obviously, keeping out any kind of electric connections from that area, and, you know, designing them in a way that when the floodwaters recede, they can be turned back into public parks, public features with minimal effort. So that ends up looking a lot of times like open greenway systems. Typically, there's a really robust trail network in there. There may be playground features and benches and places to gather. But again, those features are typically built very robustly, and you're not going to see typically a lot of lighting, restrooms, things like that. So it's really about keeping it basic, but really allowing that natural connection between the floodplain and the actual river, and allowing people to access that in the times that it's not serving to hold the waters back.
Two of the parks, you know, I think that we actually showed in those slides in the beginning, Smale Park in Cincinnati. I know that they've designed to have the features like benches and things like that can actually be, some things can be actually removed and taken to higher ground. So they've had it designed it in a way that it can be relocated when they know that the Mississippi River is going to flood. And just like also in Houston, that Buffalo Bayou Park is really is something to see. Is when, you know, there's some pictures I've seen of it flooded, and then obviously when the waters reside, and it's just, and it's neat to see that, you know, that it can actually serve both functions. And I think that's something that's exciting to me, that we can get these co-benefits from these parks.
Our last episode, we talked about seawalls and how, you know, building higher barriers is sort of a way that many cities, including the city of Jacksonville, are looking to prepare for rising waters. But I think it's also really important to think about understanding that the river will flood, and allowing the space for the river to flood is what a lot of these more innovative parks are doing. Just sort of giving them the space to be, you know, versatile in its floodplain, to have that floodplain, and to make it a benefit instead of you know, trying to hold the water back. So it's great to see parks that are kind of embracing that, because it just feels like it's less damage, you know, it's less cleanup, it's less disaster recovery when you're preparing to flood instead of trying to prevent flooding. I want to jump over to contrast parks that are designed for those major flood events, and find out what parks are doing to sort of serve as a sponge in some of these smaller neighborhoods that are seeing a lot of this localized flooding happening just all the time. And I know a lot of our neighborhoods are historic and they're built up, and what we're hearing from a lot of people are there's nothing you can do, you know, and they're really looking to the gray solutions for that. But I want to know how parks are sort of helping in some of these neighborhoods to be an answer for flooding and resiliency.
Yeah, so and I just want to build off what you were saying before I jump into that. And, you know, the green to gray, green infrastructure and gray infrastructure, to me, it's not a versus. And I don't think we should be thinking about it that way. It's really a spectrum. And I think that actually the Katherine Johnson Memorial Park from Atlanta is a really good example of that, where the stormwater infrastructure piece of that's gray infrastructure. I mean, I think, and that's clear, but it was greened essentially by including it in this park, by making the top of it a turf grass area where people can recreate. And I think that both inland and coastal, infrastructure, it's helpful to look at it as a spectrum. And green infrastructure will not work everywhere or be appropriate for everywhere. We will need seawalls at some places. But in the same sense, we don't need them everywhere. And there are going to be a lot of areas where living shorelines or green infrastructure make a lot more sense. But to focus back in on the role of green infrastructure and parks for dealing with these severe precipitation events, I think that's really kind of the traditional role for urban green infrastructure is addressing exactly those events. One of the areas that they're not going to function is, green infrastructure is not going to prevent you from having a Harvey type situation. If you're getting 40 inches of rain, there's no amount of greening that's going to help you address that situation. But what green infrastructure can help you do is really reduce that peak from those daily, weekly, monthly flooding events that a lot of communities are experiencing. And they do that by, really what you should do is think about this a good green infrastructure park as a sponge. And that starts in the soil, it goes up to the plantings, into trees. All of those different natural features absorb or can hold rainwater and essentially just slow its release into the water table or into the wastewater network, and then prevent that network or the water table from rising too quickly and resulting in those flooding events. So I think that all of the common types of urban green infrastructure, green roofs, as well as the features that are installed in the parks, they all are usually designed with that goal first and foremost, of really slowing that peak and capturing rainwater where it falls, so that those regular periodic flooding events are limited in their intensity and in their frequency.
Right. Well, one thing I find fascinating is when you look at you put in stormwater infrastructure, that's gray infrastructure, and it really is designed to serve one function and one purpose only. And that's the thing that really excites me about this co-benefits with parks, is that you're building something that can be used for multiple purposes and provide multiple benefits. And so I think the return on investment is so great for the community when we can do that. And also then we can maximize the use of our space, frankly, so that we can expand, hopefully, more green areas, because they're also providing some of that, the other services that we need to be in the community, such as flood control.
Exactly.
Carl, I know that you mentioned, plant choices and of course trees are ways that these smaller neighborhood parks can absorb water. Is there anything else, especially again in these neighborhoods that are historic and built up, and maybe you have these little parks? Is there anything that you're seeing in terms of park planning that's kind of trying to rethink those spaces to serve more for this flooding and resiliency need that we're seeing more and more of as sea levels rise?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is thinking, like you just said, about how to maximize what you're getting out of that each square foot from a stormwater retention, if that's your focus. And I think we're still very much in the early days of the potential of green infrastructure. I think we can all agree on that. So I think that we're still seeing a lot of innovation in this space, but really those tried and true methods of a properly located bioretention area, increasing canopy coverage, providing those street trees with the stormwater retention wells, or kind of sponge type geoengineered material below them. Those are still, there's so many places where those techniques could still be used. I really think that's where the best bang for the buck is at this point, is really just continuing to expand what we know works. I think there's room for innovation, but don't want to throw out the basics, because there's a lot more potential hidden in there.
And I don't want to I agree with you that there needs to be a spectrum. You know, it's not an either or with green and gray, and that we need to consider all. But I am showing some favorability, obviously, to green, because I think that there's multiple benefits to it, but two, that we have defaulted historically to the gray, and so I feel like the green needs an advocate to show the benefits and to make sure people understand why this should be adopted more and in more cases, and not just always revert to what we've done historically in the past and the status quo. But I really like you talked about when we talked prior to this tonight, that somebody had talked to you about when you put in gray infrastructure, that's going to be when it's absolutely the most effective the first day. Will you talk a little bit about that real quick before we?
Yeah. Yeah, and I wish I could give credit to the person who thought off of this, but one of the most powerful arguments that I've heard for green infrastructure versus gray is that, you know, the day that the concrete cures on that your piece of gray infrastructure, that's the best day of that feature's life. From that point, it is going to degrade and need to be repaired and replaced eventually. Whereas a well-designed green infrastructure feature, essentially the day that plug is put in the ground for that grass is the most vulnerable day of that green infrastructure feature's life. It will need maintenance, but it has the ability to self-repair, to expand, to adapt to a variety of environments, to drought situations, to flood situations. It's just inherently more flexible and adaptable, in addition to providing all these additional benefits, than a piece of gray infrastructure. And I think that, but turning that paradigm on its head in that way is just incredibly powerful. And another thing that came to mind, to Shannon, your question around especially historical neighborhoods, is that in historical neighborhoods, you're almost always dealing with historical infrastructure as well. And by expanding the use of green infrastructure in those areas, you're expanding the life of that historical infrastructure, which very well may be undersized, either for the amount of development that's happened in the intervening years, or simply for the increasing precipitation amounts that we're seeing, given the impacts of climate change. So I think that, again, these things should always be seen in concert and by playing off of each other. And that green infrastructure is a great way and a very cost-effective way to extend the life of your gray infrastructure before you have to undergo that incredible expense.
That's another really good point. I want to jump now to thinking about waterfront parks, and specifically how in communities that have parks along a waterway, how the different shoreline approaches can serve as either being green or gray infrastructure, and really thinking about what you're seeing in terms of access with shorelines when it comes to parks, and that, connecting the dots with resiliency there.
Sure. Yeah. So I think shoreline is one of the classic places that we really can see quite easily that green to gray spectrum, where you have seawalls, bulkheads on one end, and then you have natural living shorelines on the other. So yeah, I think, green living shorelines are appropriate in the vast majority of shoreline settings. And when I say living shorelines, what I mean is essentially a design shoreline that completely mimics what a natural shoreline ecosystem would be. A lot of times you see them planted with the native wetland grasses. Many of them incorporate oysters or some other kind of living breakwater structure. Some incorporate stone sills or things like that. And they naturally enhance the access to the water feature. There's a gradual slope going down to it. They can have beach features incorporated with them. And I mean, even just from the most basic, like if you build a wall to keep out the water, you very well may even blocking off sight lines to the water. Like you may be at the waterfront and may not even feel like you're at the waterfront. And to really maximize all of the reasons why people want to be near the water, I think that living shorelines makes sense in so many scenarios where you're really not facing pretty extreme wave energy. Those extreme situations or areas that simply cannot flood are going to be the areas where you're going to want to approach maybe a seawall or more great infrastructure type approach. But I personally live in Annapolis, Maryland, which is a famous waterfront community, also famous historic city. And the areas for public access on our waters it's incredibly limited. Our waterfronts have been privately developed. Most people, $1 million homes line our shorelines. So those few areas where you have public land that is also waterfront, those are really precious for your community. And to simply put up a bulkhead or riprap the shoreline or put up a seawall, I think it's just incredibly short-sighted and is really depriving the community of access to the water, and such a critical part of what makes living in a waterfront community great.
Well, I will second all of that. I do think, it's just, to me though, I'm seeing a lot of parks where they are having, like you mentioned, sort of the beachfront or like the kids get your toes wet kind of segments. And I'm just wondering, as working with so many parks being developed all over the world, why are we seeing that? Where's the demand for that coming from?
So you're saying that you're not seeing as much water access and living
No, I'm
shorelines
saying the new parks that are being developed now have these features where people can come and get their toes in, and it just seems like, I don't know if there's more demand for that or if it's but why is that feature, I guess, coming back, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, part of it, I think, is the fact that we're living in a world that is driven by climate change right now. And I think we're just aware that we need to plan for a future that is going to continue to change. And like I mentioned earlier, green infrastructure, green living shorelines, due to the fact that they're living, they are inherently adaptable and flexible for uncertain futures, which I think is a huge advantage for them. And then I think the other one is, we've seen a lot of failures, to put it frankly, of great infrastructure. I think there's a lot of engineers out there who will talk about how robust and great infrastructure is, and then a couple of weeks ago, a dam collapses in Michigan. So nothing is perfect. Everything requires maintenance, and I think that people want to have that connection to place that comes with kind of a natural environment, green infrastructure. So I think that all of that is really starting to play into this. And then, I mean, of course, at the end of the day, it is a money question, right? Someone has to pay for this, whether it is green or gray. And someone is going to most likely look at a proposal that is for a seawall and compare it against a proposal that's for a living shoreline. And I think that as the green infrastructure space and the living shoreline world has continued to evolve and become more established, that we're starting to see that that equation really start to tip in the favor of green infrastructure. Even just not calculating any co-benefits, just for what it costs to put in. I think there's a lot of situations where living shorelines achieve all of the same goals at a lower cost than great infrastructure. So I think those are just a handful. And then people want multiple benefits. People don't want to go to a space that does one thing for them and one thing only. They want to go to a space that they can see a blue heron hunting for fish, and they can get their toes wet, and they can launch their kayak, and they can have a view of the sunset, and they can, have a basketball game like that. They want to do all of that. And that's, again, it's all about the co-benefits. Should be the title of this episode.
I want to be able to jump, with the time that we have left, to any questions from people that are on the call tonight. We did have some that were submitted before, but I always like to default to those that are here that tuned in. I can either unmute you, or I think you can probably just click unmute yourself if anyone has any questions.
Bill, you need to unmute it.
Yeah, I was going to say, Bill, you're unmuted.
I was clicking the wrong button. Yeah. So, what kind of relationship do you have with the organizations like Groundwork Jackson that is developing McCoys Creek and Hoga's Creek and the Emerald Belt there? That seems like a perfect example of potentially of what you're talking about. It's kind of a pipe dream right now, but they got some money, but it's going to take a lot of money. I don't know what your feelings are about that, and if that's something you're actively involved in, or you're just more in an advocate role and an educational role.
I can take that one, unless Carl, do you have any direct experience with Groundwork Jacksonville? I know you're more of a national organization than, working locally here, but Groundworks is a national organization, and I can speak more specifically to the Emerald Trail here.
Yeah, I mean, so NRPA, we have worked with Groundworks. We've actually worked with them on a different project in Atlanta to create some local green jobs around getting plastic out of waterways there, and actually in that same watershed that the park was located. And I think, moving forward, one of the huge opportunities I think for green infrastructure is really that workforce development component of it. And I think the fact that we're all speaking right now, but there's an unemployment crisis, there's a lot of interest at all levels, I think, of looking at a new CCC type approach to put people back to work and start to build more green infrastructure across the nation. So NRPA is starting to engage in that conversation and see how local parks could be the site for some of that work. And we are actively looking to work with organizations like Groundwork or the Core Network or some of the other major players in that space. But Shannon, you can speak to the local situation.
Yeah, well, so we've been working with Groundwork Jacksonville since they started, and one of the most exciting things that they are pretty well underway with is the McCoys Creek restoration, which is just one segment of the overall 33-mile Emerald Trail. It's about 2.5 miles of it. And the really great thing about that site, that particular segment of the Emerald Trail, is that it involves every single thing that we talked about today. So naturalized shorelines, designing to flood, really working with the community on, trying to figure out what amenities do you all want to see. We know that parks, there was actually a Forest Street Park over there was removed from the community and sold. It's now a charter school. And so Groundwork Jacksonville was working with the community to find out, do we need to rebuild the tennis courts and the basketball courts that were lost, the community center that was lost in that somewhere else, or are there other amenities that you all want to see? One of the really great things that came out of the community engagement process was the understanding that people want to be able to fish from McCoys Creek. And that water quality has always been a major concern from the residents there. And so water quality is something that's being addressed right off the bat in the restoration project, as well as creating fishing pavilion platforms so that people can access specific areas in order to be able to fish. But other things too, like you can't just go and close McCoys Creek Boulevard and not think that the community's not going to want their road access back. So a road traffic study was done in order to find out where a detour point can remain, so that when that train bridge is blocking that McCoys Creek Boulevard, which it does like every day multiple times, and people get backed up in traffic, that they still have a way around, so they're not stuck at 30 minutes at certain points, because the road was removed in order to allow the creek to flood, because the road is in the floodplain, really in the floodway. So we've been working with Groundworks Jacksonville on more of the water quality side of things, but of course they have a very ambitious plan over the next 10 years to build out that 33-mile segment. And I think that breaking it into chunks working with the community, building their job core segment, having their green team, you know, all the things that they're doing is just completely in line with what we would love to see the city doing in so many places throughout Jacksonville. It's a great model, a great example. But thank you for bringing up that example. We did have a question submitted asking if we should expect Jacksport or Shad Khan to fund some of these amenities, and that's something that St. John's Riverkeeper has been advocating for as a possible mitigation for the dredging, to fund more creek restoration projects and mitigation projects, allowing for space for floodwaters to go and reconnecting wetlands for the last 5 years. So yes, we definitely think Jacksport should be funding projects, either the Emerald Trail or similar projects like this one, but that's a potential source for the projects that Carl's talking about, enhancing our parks, as well as overall resiliency and mitigation funding in the city of Jacksonville. Jimmy, I see you nodding there, but
no, you said that well, Shannon. Anybody else on the call that has a question? Because I think we had one other question.
Yeah.
People that had submitted it prior.
I was going to try and formulate a question, but I'm not sure it makes any sense. I was going to ask Carl. Thanks, by the way, Carl. It was great hearing you speak. We have a couple of spots that Jimmy and others we've been in discussions about where there's a potential. Well, there's an existing park downtown, and a potential spot for a park. But it tends to be that the parks are all on the river, and I guess the best way I could describe it is that it's kind of a hybrid between gray and potential green, where you have dock, you have bulkhead. A lot of these things are damaged. I assume the city's going to try and repair them at some point. Is there a way, once it's already constructed that way, to somehow create a more hybridized green-gray kind of? In other words, is there anything you can do to make existing infrastructure that may or may not be repaired more green once it's so obviously what it is? So, which is bulkhead and
yeah, I mean, you know, obviously that question is very, I mean, it's very site specific, all of that, right? But yeah, I mean, I think there's always ways, and I mean, I'm sure there are other people thinking about this, but you know, even if you wanted to do something simple, just like have some green in that space, like in the inner harbor of Baltimore, there's been some work just using floating wetlands, like little platforms of floating wetlands, just to have like that natural habitat there, you know, obviously more as an educational resource than, you know, providing really any kind of wave attenuation or real habitat. But I would, you know, I don't want to say no. And I could definitely imagine maybe some of those more structural living components, potentially incorporating oysters in some way in a scenario like that could be appropriate. But like I said, I think that's why it's a spectrum, and there are going to be areas due to the level of development behind them or level of development that's already occurred where it may be very difficult to really transform that into a living shoreline. We're actually having very similar discussions, it seems like, here in Annapolis, where our city dock, which is probably one of the most prime pieces of real estate in the state of Maryland, it's right on the water on the Chesapeake Bay, was turned into a parking lot probably in like the 60s, and sits empty and it's completely asphalted over. And they're looking at transforming that into a park, but obviously being a boating town, it'll still be a dock and a bulkhead there so that people can tie up and get off. But yeah, I think it just takes some creative thinking to figure out different solutions or other ways to incorporate green features.
Like the floating stuff, even from an aesthetic value. I mean, you know,
yeah,
like you said, educational. So
exactly, yeah.
Thanks.
And they did like in, you know, interesting in New York, I know Scape and Kate Orff, you know, they did oyster texture, they call it, project where they actually have oysters that grow along the sides of the dock. So people can see it. So it's an educational component, but also it's providing water quality benefits at the same time, which is really. Can I share my screen real quick, Shannon? Because I know we're running out of time. But I want to just show one slide, which I think is kind of neat too, that answers Dimitri's question. Let me show you real quick. I think this is kind of a neat thing. This is a planter in Lake Worth, Florida. So you can kind of see how they had the bulkhead, but then they used a combination of gray and green to create this mangrove planter. So they're going to have mangroves growing in here along the shoreline, which I think is really cool. And you could see that kind of thing along our riverfront, where you actually create these structures, and you can see the water is designed to flow in and out of that structure. And so I think that's kind of an idea of how you could incorporate, a combination of those things like you were talking about, Dimitri.
I want to thank you, Carl, for joining us tonight to be able to talk about parks. I also want to plug our next episode, episode 4 on July 15th, is Nature the Next Big Thing in Infrastructure. Join us to better understand the green versus gray debate and what the City of Atlanta has done to lead the way. Our guest speaker will be Corey Rayburn, who's a watershed manager with the City of Atlanta in the Department of Watershed Management. Carl, you did a great job of segueing, I think, to that topic and to understanding that Atlanta really is leading the way. And so hearing more from the city itself on what they're doing is really exciting. But thanks again, Carl, for joining us. Thanks to all the callers and attendees for participating. And this will be up on our website probably tomorrow. So tune in, watch it again, send to your friends, whatever you like. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
so
everyone.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.